A stone fort located off the Atlantic coast of France in the Strait of Antioch, between the islands of Isle d'Aix and Oloron. Construction began in 1801 and was completed in 1857. The finished fort was 68 meters long and 31 meters wide, with a height of 20 meters. The 66 casemates of the fort could accommodate 74 artillery pieces. The garrison of the fort consisted of 260 men. In the case of a siege, the garrison could hold out for 2 months, using water and food supplies. It would seem, what more could one want? After the enormous efforts, the fort was finally built and ready to fully justify the money invested in its construction. But here it is, an irony of fate. By the time construction was completed, it turned out that the fort was no longer needed. In the more than 50 years that had elapsed since the fort was built, the range of the artillery had increased a great deal, and the coastal batteries could easily block the strait. Thus it was no longer necessary. The fort, however, remained under the French War Department and was subsequently used as a prison without taking part in hostilities. However, the fort was destined to be a prison for a short time. In 1872, prisoners were moved to a special colony on the island of New Caledonia, and the fort was occupied by the Navy. Thus Fort Boyard still received the status of a military facility and was such until 1913, when the military finally abandoned the fort. The abandoned fort became the perfect prey for thieves. Everything of any value was removed. During World War II, Fort Boyard, like all of France, was occupied by German troops. The invaders used the fort as a target for training encounters, resulting in the almost total destruction of the piers and breakwaters, and the courtyard of the fort was literally buried under the stone rubble. For the next 20 years the fort remained in utter disrepair and was gradually destroyed by the sea, wind, and seabirds. On May 28, 1962, the Beaufort was auctioned off at a starting price of 7,500 francs and was purchased by the dentist Eric for 28,000 francs. But he had no means of restoring the fortress, which was deteriorating more and more, not only because of natural influences, but also because of the many tourists who literally took it apart as a souvenir. Nevertheless, soon the whole world first learned about it in the fort. In 1966, Robert Ereker staged the final scene of his film adventures with 2 French film stars, Alain Delon and Lino Ventura, in the Fort Boyard. After a rather long break, the fort reappears on the screens again in 1980. This time in the game show Treasure Hunt, the author of which was the famous figure of French television Jacques Antoine. It was he who discovered Fort Boyard while watching Adventurers and suggested the use of the fortress for the filming of a new TV game. But while Fort had previously appeared sporadically on television, in the new game he was to play a major role. At the time the fort was the honest property of a Belgian dentist. Eric agreed to sell the fort for 1.5 million francs, and the General Counsel of the Department of the Seaside Charente took a chance on the deal. After that, Jacques Antoine, having paid a symbolic sum of 1 franc, became the owner of the fort and began to implement his project. In 1989, the reconstruction begins. At 25 meters from the fort is built platform for the berth of ships. The old fort pier had long been demolished. The courtyard was cleared of a 50-centimeter layer of bird droppings that had accumulated there over the decades, and of almost 700 cubic meters of stone rubble. 2 halls were equipped for the teleplay of the same name. A few months later, in 1990, was filmed the first release of the TV game Keys to Fort Boyard, and began a new era of fort history. That's all, friends. Support the channel with your likes and subscriptions if you were interested.